Yeah,
Putin does
yeah.
not feel any danger at all, and that's why Navalny is dead right now. Putin thinks he's winning again on the battlefield in Ukraine as aid from the West has faltered, especially with aid stuck in Congress in Washington. There is really no consequence that he feels. And again, what consequence did he face when there was an attack in a chemical weapon deployed in Salisbury on British soil? There were no consequences. And so does he feel any threat at this moment? No. Have the sanctions been able to cripple his war machine? No. So the real question is, will the West look deeper to figure out, what it would take to turn Vladimir Putin and his troops around, send them out of Ukraine, and make him rethink these kinds of tactics where he feels emboldened to, carry out state-sponsored murder in other countries on other soil? I mean, the evidence is there. The investigations have been done. And so you've answered the question. No, he does not feel any jeopardy at the moment.
There are reports this morning that police in Russia have been arresting demonstrators on the street following the news of Alexei Navalny's death. The human rights group OVD Info is quoted as saying more than 100 people have been detained across the country. David Herszenhorn is Russia, Ukraine and East Europe editor at the Washington Post and author of The Dissident, Alexei Navalny, Profile of a Political Prisoner. David, welcome to the programme. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
First of all, then, where are we? Coming up on 24 hours, I suppose, since news broke of Alexei Navalny's death. I just have to ask how you reflect on that. Did you feel like this was imminent in some way? It's horrible to say, but were you surprised in any way at all?
As we say, we're all shocked, but not surprised. I wouldn't say that everybody thought this was imminent, but many of us thought this was unfortunately inevitable. The longer Navalny was in prison, the longer he was in the clutches of a government that had tried to kill him several times before, the more likely this awful scenario. Certainly, he predicted it. People close to him had said it. The amazing thing is that still there's an ability for the Putin regime to create a sense of doubt that, in fact, this was anything other than state-sponsored murder. They wanted him dead. They made that clear. And now he is dead, according to the Russian prison authorities, who had him in control at every moment.
And with that element of doubt, David, will there ever be sort of confirmation to a satisfactory level of what has happened here?
His team is sending a delegation, they say, to the far north to try to get close, presumably to try to recover his body. It's really tragic, but of course we know that at all the points when there have been incidents like this and the West has demanded investigations, Russia has thwarted those investigations. It wouldn't cooperate in the investigation for the downing of MH17, a civilian jetliner shot down with a Russian weapon over eastern Ukraine. It wouldn't cooperate with investigations into the poisoning attacks in Salisbury or murders in a park in Berlin. The list goes on and on. The poisoning of Navalny in 2020. Russia, a party to the Convention Against Chemical Weapons, and yet thwarting an international investigation. And you spoke earlier about the call for accountability, the call from politicians like David Cameron. Alexei Navalny would be livid, and he would be so angry at politicians just like David Cameron. What did David Cameron do when he was in power to hold Putin accountable to the things he was doing back then? What did Theresa May do when Salisbury occurred and it was highly likely that the Russian government had carried out a poisoning attack on British soil? He would have the same thing to say about the Americans. His daughter, Dasha Navalny, has said the same thing. Always this pragmatic approach from the West, playing footsie with a dictator, thinking that there were some other more important issues, and here's the result.
That's a really interesting point, David. What is the alternative? How do you confront Vladimir Putin on these issues in a way that is effective and not detrimental to the safety and security of people like Alexei Navalny and his opposition? What is the alternative?
Well, we're journalists. This is not our job to make policy, but we can look to a policymaker like the foreign minister of Lithuania, who says the West has the tools, the weapons, the means to defeat Russia, to eject Russia from the sovereign territory of Ukraine, and it continues to refuse to do that day after day. Now, that would mean sacrifice. It might mean the kind of sacrifice that the Western alliance was willing to make in World War II when it faced the same kind of totalitarian fascist threat that we're seeing now rise from Moscow. So it's really a question of how much are people willing to sacrifice for freedom? Are they willing to recognize that if Putin isn't stopped, and this is what Landsbergis and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and others warn about, he will continue and try to impose the kind of totalitarianism, the kind of dictatorship that exists in Russia on the countries like the UK and France and the United States. He does not want to stop.
In terms of these demonstrations that we're hearing reports of this morning on the streets in places in Russia, what do you think about that, David? And I'm just going to add the sort of context. I was reading this earlier, that when Alexei Navalny was kind of first detained, as it were, years ago, sort of back in 2013, there were thousands of people on the streets of Moscow protesting at that point. But since then, the protests have kind of fizzled, and the repression of opposition has obviously continued. Are you sort of energized, refreshed to see that there may be people taking to the streets once again?
It's heartening, I guess, to see that human beings are so resilient that no matter how hard they are persecuted, that they will still stand up for their rights. But when we say fizzled, and we use sometimes these words as reporters, in fact, it has been stomped out, right? Yeah. The wartime climate in Russia is just brutal. And, children who draw, pictures in art class in school, in primary school, in favor of peace, end up persecuted by the authorities, end up reported to the FSB. Their parents, and in one case, one father, a single father, thrown into jail because of his daughter's anti-war, drawing in school. This is the kind of climate that exists. So to the extent that there's anybody out on the streets, they're being extremely brave in a climate that is, very hostile to their desire to have freedom of speech. And Navalny's told his supporters over and over again not to be afraid.
Not to be afraid, indeed. In terms of the assessment, just in terms of continuing the considerations of the world leaders' responses, is there any way in which you can assess this to be a dangerous moment for Vladimir Putin? Is he in jeopardy of some sort of retaliation or any sort of consequence? Now, I'm thinking particularly of sanctions that have been placed on Russia since the all-out invasion of Ukraine, which don't seem to have overly bothered him. Frankly, there's an indictment from the International Criminal Court. Once again, he doesn't respect that in any way at all. I'm just wondering what options are left and whether this is a moment of danger for Putin.
You've answered your own question. No, yeah, Putin does not feel any danger at all, and that's why Navalny is dead right now. Putin thinks he's winning again on the battlefield in Ukraine as aid from the West has faltered, especially with aid stuck in Congress in Washington. There is really no consequence that he feels. And again, what consequence did he face when there was an attack, a chemical weapon deployed in Salisbury on British soil? There were no consequences. And so does he feel any threat at this moment? No. Have the sanctions been able to cripple his war machine? No. So the real question is, will the West look deeper to figure out, what it would take to turn Vladimir Putin and his troops around, send them out of Ukraine, and make him rethink these kinds of tactics where he feels emboldened to, carry out state-sponsored murder in other countries, on other soil? I mean, the evidence is there. The investigations have been done. And so you've answered the question. No, he does not feel any jeopardy at the moment.
Well, you've answered it with a lot more detail and insight than I could. David, it's great to have you on. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That is David Herszenhorn, Russia, Ukraine and East Europe editor at the Washington Post, also the author of The Dissident, Alexei Navalny, Profile of a Political Prisoner. I was quite struck by what David was reflecting there, the sort of anger and frustration at politicians and world leaders who are now saying, Putin must be held accountable for this. But the question is, well, hang on a second, what have you been doing while Alexei Navalny's been detained in this way over the last number of years?